So, welcome to this online presentation sponsored by the Jane Austen Society of the UK. My name is Heather Thomas and I am the chair of the Society's Board of Trustees. I'd like briefly to introduce the three presenters who are all members of a group of 7 who have this year launched the Overton Jane Austen Trails. We have Noelle Gibbs, who is a journalist and freelance editorial assistant for science journals. Valda Stevens trained as a biologist and worked for many years for the Open University Faculty of Science. She's a keen local historian. And finally, Anna Tame studied English literature at the universities of Exeter and Kent, and she's a communications consultant and facilitator. All three live in Overton. And I now will hand over to them for their presentation on Austen's early Hampshire life, exploring the community that shaped her. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the invitation to speak. So I'm Anna Tame, and as Heather said, I'm joined by my colleagues Noelle and Valda today as volunteers from the Overton Jane Austen Trails group. Now, as you can see, the topic of our lecture is Jane Austen's early Hampshire life, exploring the community that shaped her. Jane Austen spent the first 25 years of her life in Steventon, Hampshire, a fact many know. However, fewer recognise the close connections she and her family had to the nearby villages of Ash, Dean and Overton, which, as you can see from this illustration, were clustered very closely together. These villages were significant in shaping her formative years. And yet, they're often overshadowed by more famous Austen locations like Bath, Winchester and Chawton. And Overton, in particular, has slipped off the Jane Austen map. As residents of Overton, we founded the Overton Jane Austen Trails to reclaim its place in Jane Austen's story because we believe it deserves greater appreciation. We did a great deal of research to create these trails, uncovering connections between Jane, the Austen family, and our villages. We like to think that we've shed some new light because we're looking at Jane from the perspective of this place, and we don't believe anyone has sought to do that before. So today, we'll take a virtual walk through the community that shaped Jane Austen's early years. Some of what we share may be familiar to you, and some of it may not. Either way, we hope you enjoy it. Jane Austen was a great walker. She frequently walked the lanes and footpaths to visit friends and neighbours. And walking was very important to her, as this quote from Pride and Prejudice suggests. She has nothing, in short, to recommend her but being an excellent walker. Inspired by Jane Austen's love of walking, we created the Overton Jane Austen Trails to retrace Jane's footsteps and allow us to explore the small community that influenced her early years and, no doubt, her writing. Our trails include a 9-mile circular walking trail and a separate cycle route, both going from Overton to Steventon, and a shorter village trail giving us a glimpse into what Overton would have been like when in Jane Austen's time. Now, we are fortunate that many of the buildings from Jane's time remain, and the countryside is much as it would have been. And so our trails offer a chance to experience this part of Hampshire, the place Jane called home. So Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December, 1775 in Steventon in the county of Hampshire in the south of England. And she lived there until 1801, 25 years later. This map from 1791, when Jane was aged 16, shows how small and interconnected the area was and still is today. You can see Steventon here is just a couple of miles as the crow flies from Overton, Ash, and Dean. The villages formed a social circle of landed gentry and the clergy, but there were also labourers, those who worked on the farmland and servants, all living together in this community. And we can see on this map the names of the wealthy families living in Jane's neighbourhood. Here we have the Portals. We can see the Lefroys here, for example. We're going to meet some of these people today. Jane was the second youngest of 8 children born to Reverend George and Cassandra Austen at Steventon Rectory. Jane's nephew later described it as the cradle of her genius. This small hamlet had just 150 residents in 30 houses. It was a rural community, as it is today, although the rectory has since been demolished. As well as being rector, Jane's father, George, farmed the land. He also ran a boys' boarding school from the rectory, and one of his pupils was Richard Buller, son of Overton's rector and a lifelong friend of Jane. Another pupil was Tom Fowle, to whom Jane's sister Cassandra later became engaged and who tragically died. Jane's father also fostered Jane's literary talent. At a time when novels were not yet considered entirely appropriate, Jane's mother subscribed her to a lending library, and her father gave her unrestricted access to his books. With this family support, Jane began writing First Impressions, later published as Pride and Prejudice, in October 1796 at the age of 20, and completed it by August 1797. Her father proudly submitted it for publication in November, but it was declined by return of post. You can see his letter here, which he signs Steventon, near Overton, Hampshire. Jane had a significant creative output and completed early versions of some of the most famous of her novels here, eventually published as Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Northanger Abbey, all while living in Steventon. St. Nicholas's Church, where Jane's father was rector, still stands today. Here it is. Jane's brother described it as a little spireless fane just seen above the woody lane. This fane, or church, is a place Jane knew very well indeed. And today it's little changed, except as you see now, it has a spire. The clergy were a very important part of Jane's community and her life. Like Edward Ferrars in Sense and Sensibility and Edmund Bertram in Mansfield Park, Jane's father was not an absentee rector. Somewhat unusually, he lived and served in his community. The Digweeds lived at Steventon Manor, the parish's largest farm. The Digweed brothers were close in age to Jane and frequently mentioned in her letters. As you can see, Jane writes, "We are to have company to dinner on Friday, the 3 Digweed and James." In 1798, after nearly losing her writing box, Jane wrote to her sister about her distress because, she said, "it contained all my worldly wealth and my dear Harry's deputation." So dear Harry was Harry Digweed, given permission to shoot on Jane's brother Edward's land, a sign of their close friendship. During our research, we found a record which is the bishop's transcript for Steventon Church in 1797, when George Austen records conducting 3 baptisms, 2 marriages, and 1 burial in the whole year. It shows what a small place Steventon was. The transcript is signed by George Austen as rector, and we think here we can see Hugh, the father of the Digweeds, as church warden. Another indication of the interconnectedness of this rural community. Now next, we're going to visit Ash Park. So Ash Park here was the property of Mr. Joseph Portal, whose name we can see here, but it was tenanted by Mr. James Holder. Mr. Holder featured frequently in Jane's letters from Steventon, and the Austens were regular visitors at Ash Park. Like Sir Thomas Bertram in Mansfield Park, Mr. Holder's wealth came from a West Indian slave-owning plantation. And Jane wrote to her sister, "I was shut up in the drawing room with Mr. Holder alone for 10 minutes, and nothing could prevail on me to move 2 steps from the door, on the lock of which I kept one hand constantly fixed." Mr. Holder was a bachelor in his late 50s when Jane was 26, and we might imagine that Jane was suspicious of Mr. Holder's intentions when alone with her. On our trail, we also pass Cheesedown Farm, an area of about 200 acres farmed by Jane's father. Jane writes to her sister about a gift for their brother. "My father furnishes him with a pig from Cheesedown. It is already killed and cut up, but it is not to weigh more than 9 stone. The season is too far advanced to get him a larger one." It reminds us that Jane was well acquainted with the business of farming, and a farm needs farm workers. Jane Austen expert Deirdre Le Fay believes it's likely that the Littleworth family were the workforce at Cheesedown Farm. Deirdre Le Fay also believes the Littleworths had a special relationship with the Austens, and that it was the Littleworth family who raised the Austen children. According to Jane's nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, Jane's parents put out their babies to be nursed in a cottage in the village. And there were other connections. Anne, or Nanny Littleworth, was one of the Austens' maidservants at Steventon. Her husband, John, was coachman to James Austen. Jane herself was godmother to their eldest daughter, Eliza Jane, also named after her. In her Jasna essay, The Importance of Servants in Jane Austen's Novels, Natalie Walsh notes that when the awful Fanny Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility complains about having to pay annuities to old superannuated servants, we know Jane disapproves of this attitude. The mutual loyalty and respect between the Austens and the Littleworths is something that evidence suggests Jane truly valued. Our research revealed that on the 6th of October, 1796, Jane Austen, along with her future sister-in-law Mary Lloyd, witnessed the marriage of William Littleworth to Elizabeth Lovell at Steventon Church, and Jane's father performed the marriage service. This is a sure sign of the special bond between these families. And Deirdre Le Fay argues in her article, The Austens and the Littleworths, that the couple who were the foster parents for the Austen babies are most likely to be John and Elizabeth Littleworth from Cheesedown Farm. And through our research, an Overton local came forward to tell us that she is a direct descendant of that same John and Elizabeth Littleworth, Jane's foster parents. This local lady is the 8 times great-granddaughter of John and Elizabeth, and remarkably, she and her family still live in Overton, and she's rightly proud of her long connection to the Austens. Now, we'll hear more about Overton later in the talk, but for now, it's worth me saying that many of the family names from Jane's time are still families living in our villages today. Down the lane from Steventon, Mrs. Lloyd rented Dean Parsonage from Mr. Austen in 1789. Dean Parsonage stood at the end of Church Driveway, but it's no longer there. The Lloyds became an important part of the Austens' lives. Mrs. Lloyd lived with her 2 daughters, Mary, who we've just encountered, who later married James Austen, and Martha. Martha was significant in Jane's life. She and Jane became close friends, and they later lived together at Chawton. They also shared a passion for walking, Jane describing themselves as desperate walkers. Across the lane from Dean Parsonage is Dean House, the home of the Harwood family. Jane writes often about socialising at Dean House. We all dined at the Harwoods on Thursday and the party broke up the next morning. The Harwood brothers, John, Earl and Charles, were all a similar age to Jane, and according to Jane's nephew, the Harwoods had some racy peculiarities of character. Earl Harwood was the middle son and seemed a little wild. Jane describes a particularly racy incident he was involved in. Earl Harwood has been again giving uneasiness to his family and talk to the neighbourhood. About 10 days ago, in cocking a pistol in the guardroom at Markhow, he accidentally shot himself through the thigh. One most material comfort, however, they have, such a wound could not have been received in a duel. Jane says this with some relief. Duels were not illegal, but they were on the brink of decline through a change in public opinion. And in Sense and Sensibility, Colonel Brandon alludes to a duel with Willoughby. So Jane knows firsthand that duels were a heady mix of honour and scandal. So the Bramstons were another of the landowning families. And here on the map, if you can see my cursor, this is Hall Place, where they lived, also known as Oakley Hall. And you can see the Bramston name here. And you can see just how close this is to Steventon. So the Austens were frequent visitors to Oakley Hall. Jane writes, "At Oakley Hall we did a great deal, ate some sandwiches all over mustard, admired Mr. Bramston's porter and Mrs. Bramston's transparencies." So transparencies, as you may know, were hand-coloured prints or drawings and were very popular and displayed with pride in the wealthier homes. The family included Wither Bramston and his wife and sisters, Henrietta and Augusta, of whom Jane later wrote, "Mrs. Augusta Bramston owned that she thought Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice downright nonsense." Now here we see a newspaper report from the Hampshire Chronicle, which is a newspaper that still exists today. And it describes how a highwayman on the 6th of June last, about 10 o'clock at night, stopped the carriage of W. Bramston, Esquire, and robbed 2 ladies of 11 or 12 guineas at Hyde Hill, near Overton aforesaid. We don't know if this was Augusta and Henrietta, but we can imagine it was a very frightening ordeal. The main London to Exeter road, which passed close to Steventon, Dean and Ash and through Overton, was a busy route with coaches and private carriages. And travel could be a dangerous business. The mail coach was armed to deter highwaymen with a rear guard carrying a blunderbuss and 2 pistols. In Jane's time, Ash had a population of 95 and just 20 houses. The Reverend George Lefroy and his wife Anne moved to Ash Parsonage in 1783 and became an integral part of the Austen family circle. Mrs. Lefroy was clearly stimulating intellectual company for Jane. She writes, "We had a very pleasant day on Monday at Ash. James and Mrs. Augusta alternately read Dr. Jenner's pamphlet." At the time, Dr. Jenner's new ideas on inoculation against smallpox were controversial, but Mrs. Lefroy actively supported it, even undertaking to inoculate the local community herself. The Lefroy name is associated with Jane's brief flirtation with Tom Lefroy, Mrs. Lefroy's nephew, one Christmas at Ash Parsonage. But Mrs. Lefroy is significant in Jane's life in her own right. She was a highly intelligent woman, socially minded, interested in the education of girls and the health of the poor. And the older woman became a close and trusted friend of Jane's, who clearly found her company stimulating, as you can see from her disappointment when she was not there. "I expect a very stupid ball. There'll be nobody worth dancing with and nobody worth talking to but Catherine, for I believe Mrs. Lefroy will not be there." Mrs. Lefroy often rode or took the donkey cart from Ash Parsonage into Overton to shop and to meet friends and neighbours. As you see, she says often in her letters, references to that shopping. "I drove the donkey up the lanes by Overton. As we returned, we met Jane Austen, who had been to call at Free Folk and heard that John Portal was so ill that he had been obliged to leave home immediately." Now, this is James Austen, Jane's brother, and the Portals, another significant family who we'll meet later. And it was on one such shopping trip to Overton that Mrs. Lefroy had an accident at the top of Overton Hill. Sadly, she died from her injuries, and the loss of her dear friend upset Jane very deeply. She later commemorated her in a poem. By her example, we can infer that Mrs. Anne Lefroy encouraged Jane Austen to think, to have views and opinions, and to express them. As we've now arrived in Overton, I'm going to pass to my colleague Valda Stevens, who's going to tell us more about Overton in Jane Austen's time.
Hello, everyone. I'm Valda, and I'm going to tell you a bit about Overton and go to the end of our talk. Overton was described as a neat little town in the Universal British Directory in 1798. It had a population of about 1,100 and 300 homes, which made it a much larger settlement than Steventon, Ash and Dean, and about half the size of the town of Basingstoke, 8 miles away. The people worked in farming and also trades, manufacturing and handicrafts. Overton parish was noticed as a good area for growing barley and had 3 malt houses to prepare the barley to make beer. It was also noted for its sheep fair, trading thousands of sheep and lambs, with 4,000 sheep recorded on the parish farms in 1795. The River Test runs through. Its source is near Ash, providing water to power 3 corn mills and a silk mill. The centre of Overton would have been a busy place, with the turnpike road from London to Exeter and with coaching inns to change the horses, which needed to be done about every 10 miles along the route. This image here of St Mary's Church and Court House shows how close they were and within a rural community, and you can still see both of these buildings today. Jane's brother James Austen became curate at St Mary's Church, Overton in 1790, living first at Overton Vicarage. On marrying Anne Matthew at nearby Laverstoke, he moved to the grander courthouse, standing as it still does on the hill next to the church. According to Deirdre Le Fay, the Austens would obviously have visited James while he was living at Overton, whether at the vicarage or courthouse. It was after a shopping trip to Overton, where Mrs. Lefroy met and spoke to James, that she had the accident at the top of Overton Hill that resulted in her death. James was curate at Overton Church, which inside looks very much as it did in Jane's day. The outside was changed in the Victorian period, with a new tower built in 1908 after the old one became unsafe. As well as her curate brother, James Austen, her father, the Reverend George Austen, the rector of Steventon, occasionally also performed services in Overton. We can find their signatures in the parish records. So here we've got a marriage conducted by George Austen, rector of Steventon. And here on the bishop's transcript submitted to the Bishop of Winchester, James Austen, curate of Overton. Jane Austen's home and social world was immersed in the church. Clergymen feature in all of Jane Austen's novels. William Harrison was vicar at Overton from 1796, presumably living at Overton Vicarage that James Austen had found too small. The Harrison family were in the social circle of Jane Austen, and Jane refers to William Harrison, his sister Mary Harrison, and their mother, Mrs. Harrison, in her letters. James Austen's wife, Anne, sadly died soon after the birth of their daughter, and knowing James was looking for a new wife, on the 5th of September 1796, Jane wrote to her sister Cassandra, "Let me know which of the Marys will carry the day with my brother James." She was referring to Mary Harrison and Mary Lloyd. Mary Lloyd won the day. Now let's have a look at what Overton was like. Its merchants, manufacturers and traders, and we'll meet some of them. I don't expect you to read this list, but this document shows you one of the sources of information that we've used for this presentation. So, in Overton, you could buy a wide range of goods, just about every necessity of life. A trade directory lists 5 grocers, a fishmonger, and a butcher. There were shoemakers, a carpenter, tailors, a breeches maker, a collar maker, a glazier, a fellmonger who prepared hides for tanning, and even a clockmaker. There were services, including a hairdresser, blacksmiths, and bricklayers. Liquid refreshment could be had at the Greyhound, Red Lion, White Hart, and New Inn. The New Inn also housed the post office. All Jane's letters from Steventon are postmarked Overton. Oh, sorry. Right. We can see John Irving listed on the list of traders as a mercer, and it seems likely that this is the person that Jane Austen refers to as the Overton Scotchman from whom she bought her shifts and stockings. We see a Mr. Lambole listed in the directory as a hairdresser, And there was also Mr. Lambole, who was the postmaster. We see that Jane was in dispute with him over the cost of postage. At that time, the recipient paid to receive the letter, not the person posting it. In January 1801, Jane Austen wrote to her sister from Steventon and thanked her for her letter, but complained. "I would have been more grateful for it if I had not been charged 8d. instead of 6d, which has given me the torment of writing to Mr. Lambole on this occasion." From 1796 until his death in 1834, Mr. George Lambole, alternatively spelled Lambold, was the postmaster at Overton. And here, if you look very, very closely, you can see the Overton stamp as a postmark. All Jane's letters from Steventon were postmarked Overton. And if you've watched the recent BBC series Miss Austen, you may have noticed Overton stamped on the letters Jane sent from Steventon, shown there. On the 1st of December 1798, Jane Austen wrote to her sister to let her know, "Lizzie Bond is just apprenticed to Miss Small, so we may hope to see her able to spoil gowns in a few years." If we look at the list of traders, etc. in Overton in 1798, there are 3 Smalls included. George Small, a farmer, Thomas Small, a miller, and another Thomas Small, a maltster. There are no women listed amongst the traders, but Deirdre Le Fay believed that Miss Small was the dressmaker in Overton. In her letter to her sister, Jane did not feel the need to clarify who Miss Small was, so both sisters were obviously familiar with her. Lizzie Bond was the son of John Bond, who was George Austen's farm bailiff at Steventon, who is frequently mentioned in Jane's letters. Lizzie Bond went on to marry Joseph Beale of Overton at Steventon in 1809. Joseph Beale is listed in the list of traders as a maltster and a freeman. That's somebody who had a vote. Listed as one of the principal inhabitants of Overton in the Universal British Trade Directory is John Lovett, Esquire. Jane is very familiar with John Lovett. He attends the same social events as the Austens, and Jane even thinks he's a suitable dancing partner for her sister at a ball. We have only 34 remaining letters written from Jane Austen's time at Steventon, but we know from Jane's beloved friend, Mrs. Lefroy, that Mr. and Miss Lovett dined with us, and Lord and Lady Portsmouth came to tea. John Lovett, as one of the principal inhabitants of Overton, would have been comparatively wealthy. There was a wide gulf between the rich and the poor, with the poor providing farm labour and servants. Poverty was probably the most important social backdrop of the late 18th, early 19th century as a result of years of war, with 1793 seeing the start of the French Revolutionary Wars. But before that, there was the American Revolution and a number of bad harvests. The wealthy could be victims of crime, as in this example of Mr. Lovett having a large quantity of potatoes pulled up, also 3 ducks and 1 fowl stolen. Whilst not condoning robbery, for which the punishments were harsh, perhaps the robbers were poor and very hungry. Built in 1769, there is at Overton a silk manufactory of considerable extent and importance, as it affords constant employment for a great number of women and children. The wages of the people working at the silk mill, and these are very difficult to convert to today's prices. However, we will see that 9 shillings to 10 and 6pence a week for the few men but only 4 shillings to 4 and 6pence for women. So women were paid only half the amount of men that men were. Children from age 5 would work at the silk mill. So children from 5 to 15 years, they get 1 shilling a week for the first year and an additional 3pence a week for each year that they continued. And the hours of work were 6 o'clock in the morning to 7 or 8 o'clock at night, 6 days a week. Richard Sullivan reported 140 children at work, silk winding from age 6, so advantageously for themselves in their families, and also a group of younger children who are fed and clothed until they're capable of work. In 1786, the Reverend James Fordyce visited the mill and saw 190 girls employed, calling them happy children in knowledge, virtue, and piety. This is the James Fordyce whose sermons Mr. Collin reads in Pride and Prejudice. In 1797, John Thelwell describes Overton as a wretched-looking place and contrasted the factory with the owner's house. In one, the multitude produce. In the other, a single family enjoys the wealth and prosperity of the nation. In 1801, 4 friends of Mrs. Lefroy of Ashe came to spend the day, and in the morning went first to the silk mills and then to the paper mills. We don't know what they thought about what they saw. In 1848, the mill owner became bankrupt and the mill and owner's house were demolished and sold. Not even a brick was left from the 5-story mill and house. 8 tenements remained, with families living there until the 1950s. Now there's nothing to be seen of the huge buildings on this site, just a tranquil scene of the river flowing through meadows and trees. There was no free state education in Jane's time. Overton had William Sprent's fee-paying school for boys in Winchester Street, for those whose parents could afford it. Most of the boys boarded, and the school could be compared with the Reverend Austen School at Steventon Rectory. The White Hart was one of 2 coaching inns in Overton, where the mail coach and passenger coaches could change horses. Horses only travelled about 10 miles before they needed to be changed for fresh ones. Coaches passed up and down the route from London to Exeter on a regular timetable, with Overton an important stopping point. Now, let's move a mile or so down the turnpike road to Laverstoke, home of the Portal family. As we do this, you'll see on the map that the silk factory is marked, and also further down, the paper mill. More of the paper mill soon. Laverstoke is differently spelled on this map. There wasn't a consistent form of spelling of places in these times, and you sometimes have to make quite a bit of imagination of letters to work out what things said and what they really were now. So, in 1798, Harry Portal built a new Palladian mansion at Laverstoke to the designs of the architect Joseph Bonamy. Just a few miles up the road in Steventon, the young Jane Austen was making revisions to Eleanor and Marianne, which we now know as Sense and Sensibility, in which Robert Ferrers refers to the very same architect. My friend Lord Courtland came to me the other day on purpose to ask my advice, and laid before me 3 different plans of Bonary's. This grand house still exists today. The Portals were amongst the largest landowners in the area and the grandest families, attending the same balls as Jane. In a letter in November 1800, Jane wrote, "It was a pleasant ball, and still more good than pleasant, for there were nearly 60 people, and sometimes we had 7 couple. The Portsmouths, Dorchesters, Boltons, Portals, and Clarks were there." Haverstoke was another small community with a population of about 90 and about 20 homes. Farming again was an important activity, producing wheat, barley, oats, turnips, and peas. However, a significant proportion of the adults worked at the paper mills. The Portals' wealth and social rank gave them huge influence locally. Harry Portal's father, Joseph, left the greater part of the family estate with its land and houses to Harry and his brother, William Portal. But he left the banknote paper-making business to his 3rd son, John. William Portal owned Ash Park, the home of Jane's neighbour, Mr. Holder, that we met earlier. Paper manufacture provided employment of importance to the economy and working life, not just in Laverstoke, but in the wider communities. Portals had the important contract to make paper for Bank of England notes. They also made writing paper. One of Jane's letters to Cassandra is written on Portal's watermark paper. James Edward Austen Lee wrote in his memoir, "It will be seen also that though her circle of society was small, yet she found in her neighbourhood persons of good taste and cultivated minds. Her acquaintance, in fact, constituted the very class from which she took her imaginary characters, ranging from the large landed proprietor to the young curate of equally good family. And I think the influence of these early associations may be traced in her writings." Jane's nephew recognised the influence of the community she grew up in. And we've sought to show that while there were gentry and clergy and many respectable sorts, there were also working people, poverty and crime. So when we think about her novels, we can be fairly sure that much of what we read was drawn from her experiences of her first 25 years here in North Hampshire. Steventon and its surrounding villages were more than Jane Austen's home. They were the world she knew and inspiration for her novels. This close-knit Hampshire community shaped one of the world's most beloved authors in English literature. And through our trails and research, we continue to bring her world to life today. If you'd like to come and explore the places we've described, you can find out more about the Overton Jane Austen trails on our website and social media, or scan the QR code on this slide. This is the end of our prepared presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
And thank you very much for the presentation. If you are watching the recording, the question and answer session which follows will not be recorded, and so this is where it finishes, and I'd like to thank you for watching. And if you are not already a member of the Jane Austen Society, you would be welcome to join us at www.janeaustensociety.org.uk. Thank you.